I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what to talk about in this video and trying to tease apart what part of the way I learn is being autistic and what part, kids are wild right now, what part of the way I learn is ADHD. Because I know I don't learn like my husband, who's also autistic, and I know that I don't learn like probably 4 of my kids who are autistic, but I think that I learn like one of them who's also autistic. So when we talk about it, Paul thinks primarily in pictures. Sadie and Patrick say that they think in pictures. I don't know about Tessie and Maggie. I would think maybe they also do. So loud. They've been quiet up until now. Then the camera comes on and it's like, I would think that they maybe also do too, because of the limited language. I think that they can't. That maybe makes sense to me because of the speech delays, that maybe that might be a part of it, but I can't confirm that. That's kind of my guess though, just because of Sadie and Patrick also had speech delays. Paul had a speech delay when he was younger too. James didn't, I didn't, and I think completely, totally, utterly in words. I have no pictures. You know, when they do those little, I'm not sure quite what it's called, when they do those little things that have little boxes with the stars in it. If you've done this, you know what I'm talking about, but they show the star and you're supposed to be able to, I see blackness, I see nothing. There's like different variations of how much you can, I don't see anything. When I picture things in my mind, I have words, I have a running inner monologue. There's been a lot of talk with Paul about like, how does that work in terms of my writing? I've always had a really active imagination. I'm not quite sure how to describe that because my imagination is word-based, but it works for me because it's what I have and it's what I've always had my whole entire life. I've had writing and making up imaginary worlds and living in those imaginary worlds in my mind when I needed to escape from things. But everything was always word-based, so I'm not quite sure how to explain that. I've been talking to a therapist and she was trying out different things, and one of them was a visualization exercise, and I was like, this probably isn't going to work for me because I can't visualize things. And she was awesome. She was like, okay, I have other ideas. We can move on to those. How does this work for your stories? I don't know. Yeah, but this is about school and learning. And so basically what I'm telling you is that I don't have pictures in my head. I know that was basically when people were first starting to understand autism more widely, a lot of people were talking about thinking in pictures, and that is how my kids are, but it's not at all how my brain works, even a little bit. However, my brain is very visual. I learn things visually, and I'm not very good at learning things auditorily. If it's interesting enough, I can absorb some of what I hear, generally in classes, in subjects that I'm very, very interested in. So a very good story on Audible that I am completely immersed in and not distracted from in any way, shape, or form, I might be able to do. But I'm not probably going to retain it or remember it at all the way I would something that I've seen visually. A story that I've read, with some exceptions and possibly some tricks that I use to help with school. What I would do, I'm going to bring up a class where my brain worked really well for me, and a class where it completely and totally failed me, and a class where the way I learned got me into trouble, which didn't happen very much for me. Usually it worked in my favor. I was co-valedictorian in high school. I graduated with a 4.0. Generally, I did really well in school. I like to learn. I still like to learn. And since I generally tend to be interested in a lot of different things, I could usually use the way that my brain worked in my favor academically. So senior year in math would be the example of when it worked in my favor. We had a new teacher who was having a really hard time teaching math, and most of the class was doing very poorly. And so basically in class, when he was teaching, I would just turn off my brain in terms of hearing what he was teaching, and I would read my math book. And then the night before a test, I would write out my math book. That was it. I got perfect tests for that year. I set the curve, and so he actually ended up going to the next test below mine, and I graduated with 106% in math because of that. But honestly, I didn't retain anything from that class. I didn't even feel like I really learned it. I felt like I was putting it into my brain for a very short period of time, getting through the tests and forgetting everything. It worked. I survived. My brain was able to handle the equations at the time, but it definitely wasn't long term, and I didn't really feel like I learned anything just getting through it. Generally, it wasn't like that. Usually, I could read something, and once I read it, I remember it. Probably the hardest part for me, at least in high school and college, was sorting out what was important and what wasn't. If you looked at my book, it was a lot of different underline styles because I underlined instead of highlighted because I didn't like how bright highlighters looked. They just looked, I don't know, brassy on the page. So I would underline, and I'd have like double underline, single underline, curvy underlines. Like my entire page would be different styles of underlines because everything seemed super important. I think I might be better at that now, finally. Thankfully, I could retain a lot, which was good for tests. So I usually got really good grades, except for language. I loved language. Languages were always my favorite things, and they were always something that I wanted to take and learn. And on written tests, I would get perfect scores as long as the written portion didn't have a spoken portion where we had to learn, listen, and write down an answer to what was being said. And then I would completely do horrible on that. So I took Spanish, German, French, Kosa, Japanese. I took 3 semesters of Japanese. I learned the most, probably Mandarin, from working for a family that was from China for 4 years. My roommate was from Hong Kong. She spoke Cantonese, but she just spoke Mandarin too, and she thought it would be easier for me to learn Mandarin, which was true because of the family that I worked for. But that was probably actually the most I learned. However, in a classroom setting, the reason that I liked taking language classes was I really liked how it laid out what you're supposed to respond in any given situation. I loved that. I loved that from the time I was little. I loved how there were books and they would say, like, you say this and you say this back. It was like a class on social skills. I adored that from the time that I was little. Every single language book starts that way, like a little class on social skills. But what I didn't realize until I went really to the University of Cape Town, I should have realized it when I was working 5 hours a night in my college Japanese class and still getting C's, was that I could not process hearing a language and learning it that way. I should have realized that I was just really, really bad at that. And that was the only C's I got in college. Otherwise, I could do B pluses, A minuses, just skate by. And I'll have a video about that because I went to a small college where a great deal of your grade was classroom interaction, which is why I didn't get all A's. However, I was, despite working my behind off, I was only ever going to get C's in language classes in college because no matter how hard I worked, when it came time to listening responses, I could not do it. It was awful. Even though I'd worked so hard, and these were like the classes that mattered so much to me, I was done. And when I got to South Africa and was taking a language class there, and almost your entire grade was based on the midterm and the final, and the midterm and final were going to be spoken and responding out loud. And I worked and studied, and I had a 98% in the class based on what we'd done so far in class, which was a ton of work, and it was all written and responses. And when the teacher spoke to me, I had no idea what he was saying. I could look down and I could write out everything and I could say it, but when someone spoke to me, I could not hear what they said and process it in my brain. Just like in Japanese, when the teacher spoke at a regular pace, my brain just was done. I could not do it, even though I did like all the things that I was supposed to do, and I practiced probably just about more than anyone. I wanted to be good at it, and that's when I knew I had to drop the class because I was going to actually fail a class for the first time in my entire life, and so I did. And I didn't realize until I was diagnosed as being autistic why it was so hard for me all my life, where I'd taken all of these classes and I would be so good, perfect on all of the written tests. And then anytime it came to actually listening to the language, it was like too fast. My brain just could never keep up with everybody else's. Why was it that I could write it perfectly, be fine when I said it out loud, remember it, but I couldn't hear it? I guess that makes sense. And, I actually could hear it when I was working with people and around people all of the time. So I think I actually could have done it, just not in a classroom by studying. That wasn't the way I was ever going to be able to pick it up. And the last part, so learning by listening to someone, definitely not the way for me to learn. And that leads me to the last part. Generally in classes that were just all lecture, what I would do is I would doodle in the margins. Again, I don't know if this is ADHD, usually just little lines. I would sit there and make line, little designs all along the edges of my margins. And I don't know if this actually helped me retain stuff better. It seemed like it did. Mostly I would just kind of like doodle while I would listen. And I mean, I would be listening, especially with interesting teachers. And there was this one particular teacher who was brilliant. I mean, he sang show tunes in class. He was one of the most interesting professors that I ever had. And he would get visibly annoyed when people were doing things like doodling. It was probably especially annoying because we had several football players in that class, and he was so over the top catered to the football players, but then would like, I get in trouble for doodling when I answered questions and participated, but say I'm drawing little lines in the margin while answering questions, I get in trouble for that. I don't know. It was just very irritating, and I got a B+ in that class. And it was one of the classes that I participated in the most. And I felt like I got that B+ particularly only, especially because I doodled. I don't know. When that was something that just sort of focused me and made me pay attention. I know it looked like I was distracted, and obviously it really, really irritated the man. But yeah, even though listening isn't really necessarily a strength for me, doing something with my hands seems to focus me. Because when I'm not doing something with my hands, it's like I'm focused instead on how I'm not doing something with my hands and on how I'm holding still. I guess that's what it is. I remember once my friends got irritated with me because we were going to a meeting and I wanted to bring my knitting. And they literally would not leave with me if I was going to take my knitting. It was just like a meeting with like a bunch of our friends that we were going to at night. And I just wanted to sit and knit on the couch while we were meeting. And they were like, that's so embarrassing. You cannot bring knitting to a meeting. I'm like, what's wrong with knitting? Because otherwise I'm just going to be sitting there not doing anything. Not like I was 20 going on 80, but no, I don't know. It makes me uncomfortable to be sitting there not be doing anything. Of course, now we all have our phones, so I mean, now at least I'd have a book to read. But yeah, even back then in 2003, I knew that if I was sitting there, because at that point I did have a phone, but it wasn't a phone that did anything other than make phone calls, with this little gray screen with black numbers. I wanted to have knitting in my hands so that my hands wouldn't be empty, so that I wouldn't just be sitting there not doing anything with them the whole entire time. That's probably the embodiment of ADHD, I don't know. Anyways, that is it for today. If you like this video, I would love it if you give it a thumbs up, and if you're interested in all things autism, I would love it if you did subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.